Hi Jess, hope you're doing well. I'm going to record my lesson. I really should call it a lecture though, because it kind of feels like something I would be doing if I was just speaking to you in a lecture hall with thousands of other people. Hopefully you can stick with it, and please do take a pause if you need to, and hopefully you enjoy. Let me tell you a little bit about the story of Dracula. So there's this young guy called Jonathan Harker. He's a young English lawyer, and he travels to Castle Dracula, which is in the Eastern European country Transylvania, to finish up a real estate transaction with a nobleman called Count Dracula, which I can't say without doing that accent. So as Harker wends his way through this beautiful landscape, this beautiful countryside, all the local peasants are warning him about his destination and giving him crucifixes and giving him other charms that are going to help him to fight off evil, and saying strange words which Harker later translates into vampire. So he's frightened, but he's quite determined, and he meets the Count's carriage just as he planned to, and they start on this journey to this castle, which is quite a harrowing journey. The carriage is nearly attacked by wolves on the way. Upon arriving at the castle, he finds the elderly Dracula is very well educated and very hospitable and a gentleman. But it only takes him a few days to realise that he's effectively a prisoner in this castle. And the more he investigates this, the more he finds out about the nature of his confinement, the more uneasy he becomes. He's getting a bit suspicious. He realises that the Count possesses supernatural powers and diabolical ambitions. Supernatural powers and diabolical ambitions. So the word diabolical comes from the word diabolo, which means devil. So devilish ambitions. And then one evening, Harker is nearly attacked by these three beautiful and seductive female vampires, but the Count fights them off and tells the vampires that Harker belongs to him. So he's actually now just afraid for his life, and he tries to escape from the castle by climbing down the walls. Now, while all this is going on, in England, Harker's fiancée, who's Mina, corresponds with her friend Lucy, because that's what you did in those days. You didn't send WhatsApp messages or go on Snapchat or whatever it is people do. You wrote letters and you sent them, and they arrived months later. So she's writing with her friend Lucy, and Lucy has had 3 marriage proposals. She's a very lucky girl. I mean, that's all you could hope for in those days, that you get a good marriage to a suitable gentleman who would be able to take care of you financially. So Lucy's been proposed to by a man called Dr. John Seward, a man called Arthur Homewood, and an American whose name is Quincy Morris. And she's quite sad that she has to reject 2 of them, because she likes all of them. But she accepts the man called Arthur Homewood, not the American, Arthur Homewood's proposal. So Mina visits Lucy, who is staying in a seaside town called Whitby. Now, there's this Russian ship that is wrecked on the shore near the town, and all the crew are missing, and its captain is dead. And the only sign of life aboard is a large dog, and this dog bounds ashore and disappears into the countryside. Now, there is cargo on this ship, a set of 50 boxes of earth that have been shipped from Castle Dracula. Not long after this, Lucy begins sleepwalking, quite suddenly. She's never done it before. And one night, Mina finds Lucy in the cemetery of the town and believes she sees a dark form with like glowing red eyes bending over Lucy. And Lucy from that point becomes pale and ill and quite Victorian lady, white, pale face with bright red cheeks. 2 tiny red marks just here, which we know, because we're living now, what that means. So neither Dr. Seward, who lives in Whitby as well, but isn't the man that she's going to marry, or Mina can account for what these red marks mean, or even for her illness. I mean, in those days, a lot of people got consumption and died, and women became very pale, and they were like, oh, it's tuberculosis, actually, as we now call it. But it would consume your body until you died. So that's why they called it consumption. But she wasn't testing for consumption. She didn't have consumption. So Dr. Seward, he loves Lucy, and he's sad that she's ill, even though she's not chosen him. he sends for his old mentor, who's this professor called Professor Van Helsing. Now, in the meantime, Jonathan Harker is suffering from brain fever, and he arrives in the city of Budapest. And Mina goes to join him because she's his fiancée. Van Helsing arrives in Whitby, and he examines Lucy, and he says that he wants her entire chamber to be covered in garlic. Now, garlic, as we know now, is a traditional charm against vampires. So for a little while, this seems to work. She stops being ill. She gets a bit better. She begins to recover. But her mother, unaware of the power of the garlic, removes the plants from her room because they're stinky. Most people know that the general idea, the general thought is that Bram Stoker's Dracula was based on the story of Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler was a real person. He was Romanian, what they used to call Transylvania, which is what Bram Stoker calls it in the book, but is now called Romania. That's the country we know. And his family name was Vlad Dracula. So he was Vlad III of the family Dracula. Vlad Dracula was Vlad III, and he's often known as Vlad the Impaler because of these horrible techniques he had for punishing his enemies, and he became absolutely notorious for these methods of treating his prisoners and his enemies and anyone who annoyed him. See my little dog taking her place on the sofa, and there's the other one, Alfie. He's having a nice lie down in the sunshine. Roscoe's around somewhere. Anyway, back to Vlad the Impaler. So he was born in 1431, so quite a long time ago, quite a long time before Bram Stoker wrote his book, north of present-day Bucharest. So a real place, still exists now. He was the second of four brothers into this noble family who are called the Dracula family, and his name, Dracula, his nickname, basically means son of Dracula, and it came from the Latin Draco, which if you read Harry Potter you probably know comes from the word dragon. So his father was inducted into the Order of the Dragon, which was an order created by the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. His name was Sigismund, and it was supposed to defend Christian Europe against the Ottoman Empire. So remember, he was the the second of four sons. So you know that if you're the second son, all you are is the spare. There's the heir and the spare. So he wasn't destined to be the king of Transylvania at all. So his father became the leader of an area called Wallachia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's when his whole family moved to Wallachia, which is where he spent his childhood. In 1442, Vlad and his little brother were sent to the court of the Ottoman Sultan Murad II. And in a reverse of his former position, where he was trying to defend Christian Europe against the Ottoman Empire, what he was doing in this occasion was using his sons as collateral, so as almost like a ransom, to say, look, I'm sending you my sons because I'm going to show you that I'm going to support Ottoman policies. So complete switch in his thinking. So Vlad came back about 6 years later, and at that point he was told, actually, your father has been assassinated and your brother, your older brother, has been assassinated by these other nobles, this other noble family in the region, and this happened like a year ago. So actually, you're the leader, you're the king, you've inherited it. But obviously, the people who killed his father and his older brother had taken over. They had become the leaders in this time. They were the conquerors. So Vlad embarked on this sort of series of campaigns that he was on basically his whole life to regain his father's seat, his father's leadership. He had many opponents. One of them was his own younger brother, who had stayed in the Ottoman Empire and was supported by the Sultan. And there were also many other leaders, they called them boyars. There's many other boyars who wanted to take control of the area. He was briefly victorious, but they got rid of him after about 2 months. But it took about 8 years for him to become the leader again. So he took back, eventually, his father's throne. And it was during this time that he was committing all these atrocities for which he became really well known. So he had a real favoritism. His favourite way of torturing people was impaling them on sticks in the ground. So he'd put a massive stick in the ground, like 12 feet tall, twice the size of a man, and he'd grab a human man. Well, he wouldn't himself, but he'd get his soldiers to take a man and impale them on the stick. So he might go through their bum and out their mouth, or he might just put it through their back or through their stomach, and he'd leave them there hanging on this stick to die, so that they died in horrific pain, and everyone else could see that this is what's going to happen to you if you go against Vlad the Impaler. So he would do this to foreign men, he would do it to his own people, he would do it to basically anyone who annoyed him. The most notable occasion was as he retreated from battle towards the end of his campaign, he left a field that was completely filled with thousands of impaled victims, so that when the Ottoman Empire arrived, they would come in and just see this field that was just sticks sticking out the ground with these human bodies bleeding and dying, impaled on them. So he was absolutely brutal, very bloodthirsty. He escaped Ottoman capture that year, and he was taken by the Hungarians, and King Matthias I of Hungary, who used to help him, imprisoned him. He did get back his leadership, but he was killed in battle that year. So he remains a folk hero, actually, for his efforts against the Ottomans. So in Transylvania and Romania, Vlad the Impaler is seen as a hero, which is quite interesting. So people have often thought that Bram Stoker based the character of Dracula on Vlad the Impaler, because the family name. So although Stoker does write in his notes about Dracula and the name Dracula, the historical account from the notes only mentions the name, and it doesn't mention any of those actions. It doesn't mention that he impaled people, or that he was so bloodthirsty in that kind of army fighting way, military way. So we do know that Stoker had all these conversations with this historian called Herman Bamberger, and that might have given him that information on Vlad's violent nature. But there's no real concrete evidence to support that theory, so we don't know for sure. It's a very good story, and that area of Transylvania did have a lot of folk tales to do with people rising from the dead and sucking blood and so on. So it's kind of almost like these different stories of what happened in that country in terms of that bloody battle and that bloody war with the Dracula family, also kind of merged with these folk tales of people rising from the dead, people sucking blood, that were part of that country. Now, Bram Stoker himself was quite an interesting character. He was born in Dublin in the mid-1840s, and he didn't have like a particularly rich family. He was kind of like middle class. He was quite a sickly child. His mother did a lot of work for charity, and she also was a writer. So she used to tell her son, she used to tell Bram Stoker all these wonderful tales to kind of entertain him. When he grew up, he went to Trinity College, which is like a really posh university in Dublin. It's like going to Oxford in England. And he studied maths. So he wasn't like studying all this creative stuff, he was studying maths. And when he graduated, he followed his father into working for the civil service. So just like working for the government, really, quite a boring job. But in his free time, he used to like to go to the theatre and be a theatre critic. So he'd go to the theatre, he'd look at these shows, he'd write what he thought of them, and that would get published in the newspaper. And it was a bit of a hobby, but it was one that he got a little bit of money for. And through that, he met this actor called Henry Irving. So Henry Irving was a massively famous actor at the time in the theatre. And he became really, really good friends with Henry Irving. So Bram Stoker and Henry Irving were like really good buddies. And Bram Stoker actually ended up going to London with Henry Irving to manage Henry Irving's theatre. And because he was like surrounded by all these actors and actresses, he met this actress called Florence Balcombe, and they got married, and they had a son called Noel Stoker. And Bram Stoker had this opportunity to mix with all these really famous actors and literary people. So he was very good friends with people like Oscar Wilde and Arthur Conan Doyle and Lord Tennyson, who were all like really famous writers of the time. So he did have a go at writing, but he was not particularly good at it. His work at the very beginning of his career was not very high quality. He wrote short stories for children, and then he wrote a novel called The Snake's Pass, and it was really unsuccessful. Nobody wanted it, didn't make any money. But when he hit upon the story of Dracula, he really kind of caught people's attention. People were really into this sort of gothic style that was emerging, and they were really taken by the idea of Dracula. This really changed everything for him. It was hugely successful. It was also his greatest literary achievement. So from the point of view of being a literary critic, which is what we are when we're studying English literature, it is a well-written book. So his early works were not well-written, but this was a well-written story. And it did really well, and it made him a lot of money. It wasn't immediately a success, but it has been in print continuously since the first time it was published in 1897. So it's quite successful in that way. There's been so many films about it, so many theatre shows about it, other books and stories that were inspired by it. And he just carried on writing until his death. So he died in 1912, so 110 years ago. And he wrote quite a few novels, actually, adventure novels. He wrote a book called The Jewel of the Seven Stars and The Lair of the White Worm. But none of them came close to being as successful as Dracula, and certainly didn't achieve the sort of long-lasting success, the notoriety of Dracula. We still know about Dracula, but have you ever heard of The Lair of the White Worm? So you really just had that one story. Now, vampire legends have been part of popular folklore for so long, for many ancient times, and this might be why it really grasped people. It wasn't a story that they were unfamiliar with. They knew about vampires. They knew about the idea of a creature of the night that sucked blood and took life from other living beings. In the Middle Ages and right through to now, you hear about reports of corpses rising from the dead with supernatural powers. I've just recently been watching 2 different series in which people are rising from the dead, that were filmed just in the past couple of years. And lots of people in the early days believed it. They believed that it was true, these dead people coming back with supernatural powers. And the Dracula family, which in Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Count Dracula describes with real pride in those early chapters, is based on that 15th century family as far as we can tell. And its most famous member, Vlad Dracula, who we talked about earlier, Vlad the Impaler, was a person that people knew of. He was a character that people knew of. He was a brilliant and notoriously savage character, so he did pass down through history and through the countries, even though he wasn't in our country. People at the time that Bram Stoker was publishing Dracula, they knew about it. They knew about who he was and what he had done. So these people, it's like when you watch a TV show and it's got some familiar stories in it, familiar characters in it. You're not, it's quite nice when it's something that you already know about. You've got this idea in your head already. You've already got context for it. It's interesting when you think about Vlad the Impaler, actually, because he was really horrific. We know about his military career. We know about him impaling people. But there are also accounts, like at the time, about him murdering beggars. So if he saw a beggar on the street, he would just murder them, and forcing women to eat their own babies. Can you imagine?